as Ambassador Richard's nomination to be the coordinator for counterterrorism has been stalled by Republicans, this important position has been unfilled. You know, right now we have hundreds of general officers who are being held up by one of our Republican colleagues who can't take their promotions and move on to their next deployments because they're being held up. We have multiple ambassadorial nominees who are being held up, like Ambassador Richard. We hear that one of our colleagues from Ohio is planning to hold up all nominees to the Justice Department. These are not games we're playing here. These are not games. These are serious issues that affect the ability of the United States to compete in a global environment. And holding up the people who we need in positions to address the critical challenges facing this country is really just unacceptable. I hope we can move Ambassador Richard's nomination, just as I hope our colleagues are going to stop their obstructionism and let us move on the other nominees who are critical to ensuring our national security. So with that in mind, I ask unanimous consent that the Senate proceed to the consideration of the following nomination. Calendar number 144, Elizabeth H. Richard to be coordinator for counterterrorism. That the Senate vote on the nomination without intervening action or debate. That if confirmed, the motion to consider be considered made and laid upon the table, and the President be immediately notified of the Senate's action.
Is there objection?
Mr. President.
The Senator from Texas.
Reserving the right to object. I agree with the Senator from New Hampshire that this position at the State Department is important, and it should be filled by someone qualified and someone who will use the position to stand up to the terrorists who target Americans all across the world. Unfortunately, Ms. Richard, her record makes her singularly unqualified for this post. The Biden administration has put forward many troubling and radical nominees during the past 2.5 years. Indeed, the nominees that have been put forth by this president are more extreme, are more radical than any nominees I have ever seen in my lifetime. I will say, unfortunately, our Democrat colleagues will rubber stamp whatever radical is put on this floor. And they have demonstrated an unwillingness to stand up and reject even the most extreme nominees submitted. If you look at Ms. Richard's record, and in particular, her time as ambassador to Lebanon, her record catastrophically when it concerns terrorists is to downplay the threat of terrorists, to appease the terrorists, and even, astonishingly, to fund the terrorists. While in Lebanon, Ms. Richard established a clear record of effectively boosting the Iran-backed terrorist group Hezbollah. And for all practical matters, her tenure as ambassador demonstrates that she aided and assisted Hezbollah rather than standing strong against them. Let me give you 3 examples to demonstrate these points. Elizabeth Richard shielded Hezbollah while we were fighting for Amr Fakhri's release. Ms. Richard consistently sought to downplay the threat posed by Hezbollah. Take the case of Amr Fakhri, an American citizen who was held hostage by the Hezbollah-controlled Lebanese government while he was dying of cancer. The senator from New Hampshire knows this case well because Mr. Fakhri and his family are constituents of hers in the state of New Hampshire. And she and I worked together closely, aggressively, fighting to secure his release from captivity. Amr Fakhri was an American citizen, a beloved family man, and a small business owner who traveled to Lebanon in September of 2019. While he was there, he was abducted, He was illegally detained, he was beaten, and he was held hostage. He was suffering from stage 4 cancer, and his symptoms were exacerbated by the beatings that he received at the hands of Lebanese security officials who were looking to extract a false confession. The senator from New Hampshire and I came together to pressure the Lebanese government to free Mr. Fakhri. Together, we introduced legislation to impose sanctions that would have brought down the Lebanese political class unless they immediately released him. When it became public that Senator Shaheen and I together were advancing our legislation towards passage in the Senate, Mr. Fakhri was freed. Good news. Success, a bipartisan success, freeing an American hostage in captivity in Lebanon. Unfortunately, Mr. Fakhri passed away from cancer just 5 months after he came home to the United States. But at least together we were able to ensure that he did so surrounded by his family and not by the Hezbollah-controlled Lebanese government thugs who had held him hostage. Mr. President, why did it take Senator Shaheen and me coming together on the floor of the Senate to target the Lebanese government and force them to release an American hostage? Well, one of the significant reasons it took action at the Senate level is because the U.S. Embassy in Beirut and our ambassador there were effectively running interference for the Lebanese government, were fighting against us, and effectively running interference for Hezbollah. And who was our ambassador at the time? Elizabethrichard. I want to read you what Mr. Fakhri's family says about that and what they say about President Biden's nomination of Ms. Richard. They've said, quote, "As the family of the late U.S. hostage, Amr Fakhri, we are shocked by the news that Ambassador Richard is being confirmed as the next counterterrorism czar in the State Department. Our father would still be here today if the U.S. Embassy under Ambassador Richard prioritized an American citizen's life first instead of catering to the Hezbollah-backed Lebanese government." These are the words of the family of Amr Fakhri, who you see here, constituents of the senator from New Hampshire. And this is what they say about the Senate and about the nominee that the Senate is being asked to confirm. That this is a nominee who is responsible for accelerating the death of their father because she refused to stand up to Hezbollah. Second example. Ms. Richard did not just establish a record of downplaying Hezbollah's terrorism. She also consistently sought to appease the Iranian-controlled terror group. At the beginning of 2020, the United States Armed Forces killed Qasem Soleimani, an Iranian regime arch-terrorist with blood on his hands of hundreds of American servicemen and women whom he had murdered. I'll note that the Senate subsequently passed language that I authored, specifically praising President Trump and our armed forces for the operation taking out Qasem Soleimani. The vote on the floor of the Senate was 64-34. One of the yay votes was my colleague from New Hampshire, Senator Shaheen. Meanwhile, the Trump administration sent a quick response force to our embassy in Lebanon to protect it from retaliation by Iran and Hezbollah. Yet again, American citizens' lives were in danger. And what did Ms. Richard do? She secretly sent them away. In defiance of the political leadership of the State Department, and behind the backs of Secretary Pompeo and the State Department's number 2 officer, both of whom had been confirmed by this body, she secretly sent them away, directly endangering the lives of the men and women in our embassy. Now, why did she do that? Well, this deeply troubling incident was first reported by Politico, and Politico explained her reasoning. First and foremost, she said, she didn't want to antagonize Hezbollah. Despite threats to the embassy, and despite an obligation to protect the lives of the Americans who work there, Ms. Richard left them exposed and vulnerable because her policy over and over again was to appease and avoid confronting Hezbollah. And finally, Ms. Richard does not just downplay and appease terrorism. In several cases during her tenure in Lebanon, she actively funded Hezbollah allies. Mr. President, one of the many corrupt branches of the Lebanese government is the Internal Security Forces, or ISF. According to one Lebanon expert who recently wrote about the group, they are, quote, the Hezbollah auxiliary forces who run counterintelligence for the terror group. They do Hezbollah's, quote, counterintelligence dirty work. What does that mean in plain language? It means that they break up the Israeli spy networks and espionage rings that our ally uses to track Hezbollah's threats and Iran's threats. That's what they do. It's what they've always done. Just recently, they announced that they had broken up 17 Israeli networks. The damage was incalculable to the safety and security of our friend and ally, the State of Israel, and also to the safety and security of America. And in 2022, Hezbollah publicly heaped praise on the ISF for all the work they do. But what did Ms. Richard do when she was in Lebanon? She pushed for policies to fund and boost the ISF with American taxpayer dollars. She even oversaw the building of the ISF Academy, funded by American tax dollars. Mr. President, I wish we had a nominee for this post whom I could enthusiastically support. I wish I were not obliged to come down and object to an extreme nominee whose record demonstrates she is unfit and unqualified to serve in this post. But unfortunately, President Biden has not given me that choice. Having examined Ms. Richard's record, the only conclusion is that her approach to counterterrorism consistently is to downplay terrorism, to appease the terrorists, and even to fund terrorist groups and their enablers. That approach is utterly disqualifying for a nominee for coordinator of counterterrorism. It's a policy that has had terrible consequences when she pursued it in the Middle East, and it would have terrible consequences if she took it from Lebanon and applied it globally, appeasing not just Hezbollah, but every other terrorist on earth. The Iranian regime right now, the Ayatollah right now, is pursuing murderous terrorism, including against Americans right now. The Ayatollah right now has hired a hit team with the intention of murdering the former Secretary of State of the United States, Mike Pompeo. Secretary Blinken confirmed to the Senate Foreign Relations Committee on my questioning that the State Department is spending $2 million a month providing security to Secretary Pompeo because Iran is actively trying to murder him. We need a coordinator of counterterrorism who will stand up to Iran, who will stand up to Hezbollah, who will stand up to Hamas, who will stand up to al-Qaeda, who will stand up to al-Nusra, who will stand up to ISIS, who will stand up to every terrorist in the world that seeks to murder American citizens. We need a coordinator for counterterrorism whose record is not so extreme that the grieving family of a hostage is telling the Senate our father would still be here today if the U.S. Embassy under Ambassador Richard prioritized an American citizen's life first, instead of catering to the Hezbollah-backed Lebanese government. For these reasons, I object.